The long bridge. Amelia stirred, and we adjusted to change our cramped position. I could, I supposed, climb to the upper bunk, but truthfully, I delighted to be close to this woman I loved so much. The popular cliché is that only the young are permitted to indulge this physical closeness, and definitely not people who have been respectably married for a dozen years. Now more comfortable for a while, I started to fall asleep again as the train from the noise crossed a bridge. Ah, the bridge. The bridge for my money. I already mentioned how Montreal was on an island and that we had bridged the waters to the west on the Kingston route. But the railway would only really be profitable if we also could link to the east and south. Politically, it would be desirable to have the British colonies joined by rail. Thus Moncton, St. John and Halifax should be joined to each other and via Quebec City or its environs to Montreal and thence places in Upper Canada. Ferries would still be needed to Charlottetown, and there was a question of how to get to and from Quebec City proper. If a route along the north shore of the St. Lawrence were used, then a crossing would need to be made to the south shore to get to the maritime provinces, while if a south shore route from Montreal were chosen, Quebec passengers would need to take a ferry from Lévis to get to the city itself. The question of a bridge at Quebec had been considered in 1852, but shelved as too expensive. Indeed, there is still no bridge, as Amelia and I journey north this All Hallows Night of 1895. The siting of the bridge in Montreal, and in consequence a South Shore route, was made by Thomas Kiefer, half-brother of my superior at the GTR, and also an engineer, who designed the supporting piers of the bridge. While the railway was to be the user of the bridge, the builder would be the company of Peyto, Brassey, and Betts, with superstructure designed by Hay, Robert Stevenson, and Alexander Mackenzie Ross. Stevenson's father, George, was, of course, the man who led us into the railway age with the Stockton to Darlington Railway, and the locomotive rocket, which, even if it were not the first to use it, brought the steam, 49 blast that gives trains their familiar choo-choo sound. That steam blast drew air through the firebox, making possible continuous train operation, rather than cycles to build pressure, then run along the tracks. The many interests in the bridge meant that there were plenty of discussions and exchanges. Mr. Samuel Kiefer wished me involved quite frequently in checking calculations. Even if the GTR were not directly paying for materials, he was worried that miscalculations would lead to the bankruptcy of the builders before the completion of the bridge. Thus, I was constantly estimating how much of each major material would be needed. James Hodges was the chief project engineer. He had been at the SER, but I do not think our times there overlapped. However, when I later was introduced to him, he said he had been told to watch out for me in a letter from Cudworth. This must have contained a positive appraisal of my abilities, as I later received some assignments that were directed from Hodges and were of profit to me. Hodges has described in detail the struggles we had to build the bridge in his fine book, Construction of the Great Victoria Bridge in Canada. My own role in the bridge was, as I said, to make and check calculations. This didn't prevent me, of course, from taking an interest in other things going on. One of the more interesting aspects of the bridge project was the tools and machinery that had to be developed to allow the work to be done. I was not yet in Montreal when some of these were constructed. To move materials and men to the middle of the river where the work would be executed, barges would be needed, along with tugs to move them against the swift movement of the current of the St. Lawrence. Ultimately, 25 barges were built, which had to be able to hold 100 tons of stone when laden, but still only draw at most 4 feet of water and not roll so much that workers were imperiled. These barges were 92 feet long and 22 feet in beam. To move them, 2 steam tugs, the Beaver and Muskrat, were constructed, approximately 150 feet by 26 feet, drawing only 3 feet, but with paddle wheels over 23 feet in diameter, powered by condensing engines of 30-inch bore and 10-foot stroke. These were significant enterprises in the colony. Hodges had made some rough drawings for a steam traveler, that is a gantry riding upon a pair of widely set tracks that delineated a sorting yard for stone. The traveler could move up and down the rails, and a jenny, upon the traveler could move from side to side. All was powered by a steam engine upon the traveler. From the jenny, hoisting gear was suspended, and heavy stone blocks could be moved about the sorting area and readied for loading onto the barges as required. 50. Hodges had approached contractors in England who, at least according to their assertions, built and experimented with such a device. However, when it arrived and was set up, its strength was so feeble that it was set aside for scrap. Fortunately, Hodges had shown copies of the same drawings to Benjamin Chaffee, a local contractor and self-taught engineer. He very quickly constructed a rough, crude traveler, which to everyone's astonishment worked extremely well and became much loved of the workers and engineers for its simplicity of use and reliability. This was being finished as I arrived in 1855, so I did not see the construction of it. A bit later, the same Mr. Chaffee came up with a steam derrick that could be used to position the stones for the piers. One such derrick was eventually built upon a barge. Mr. Hodges called them the most perfect derrick, a sentiment with which I must concur. Chaffee illustrated a lot of what was best about the local engineering staff. They were masters at improvisation with the materials at hand. When building track for the railways, they could find timber within short distances of the right-of-way and turn them into the most fantastic trellises and other structures. In England, we would scoff at such objects, mainly because they would not last long and were at risk of burning in a fire, for example, one of the many forest fires in the colony. In England, we would scoff at such objects, mainly because they would not last long and were at risk of burning in a fire, for example, one of the many forest fires in the colony. However, the Canadian engineers knew that the main chance was to get the railway running and generating revenue, at which point the wood improvisations could be replaced by more permanent stone and iron construction. In the case of the bridge, besides Mr. Chaffee's lifting mechanisms, we initially used specially designed cofferdams to build the piers, but later adopted the local approach of simple crib work that made use of nearby wood and stone crudely put together. For the Victoria Bridge, we could use improvised tools for the construction, but wanted a structure that without too heavy a maintenance cost. Thus, the piers were going to be made to last and to withstand ice and logs that would shove against them. Moreover, the track would live in a wrought iron tube held high enough that ships could navigate underneath. I was largely relieved of any responsibility for the 25 tubes of a rectangular cross-section that would be placed on the built-up shore abutments and 24 limestone-clad piers. The parts for the tubes were prefabricated in England, brought across the Atlantic by ship, and moved to the place of construction by barge or later by means of rails on the partial bridge. In 1855, we had only handmade quantities of steel for expensive blades or similar high-value small items. Large-scale steel was still over a decade away. Cast iron could possibly be used, but was known to become brittle in the cold. Stephenson had designed the cast iron D bridge that collapsed in 1847. So the choice was wrought iron, laboriously hammered into relatively small pieces, but sometimes with two hammers, each wielded by a team of 51 men. They would literally pound the red-hot metal into the desired shape. A scene of hell, of which I had witnessed only a much smaller version for making coupling chains. The resulting pieces of the tube were plates, angle irons, or T-irons pre-punched with holes for the rivets. Generally, the engineers were well satisfied with the accuracy of the manufacture, and the tubes came together well, albeit with a huge amount of labor to bolt the pieces through sufficient holes to line up a section, then to rivet them securely using hot iron rivets and much hammering, at that time by muscle alone. Finally, the bolts were replaced by rivets and the next section started. To avoid sagging in the middle of a span, wooden structures or trellises were built. Then jacks or wedges were used to adjust the level of the floor of the tubes as they were built to avoid sagging or other deformation in the final bridge tube. Each tube rested on one pier or abutment and rolled on rollers at the other end to allow for expansion and contraction with temperature. While the ironwork interested me, and occasionally I was called in to check the rate of delivery and use of plates, bars, and rivets, it was the support piers that sent me more calculation work. They had integral starlings, that is, surrounding bulwarks, also called cutwaters, to protect against the current of around 8 miles per hour, much faster than ducks can swim. The water was 21 feet deep, and of course it froze to thick ice in winter, and in the thaw carried blocks of ice and tree trunks from the Ottawa Valley lumber industry. Therefore, the front face of the starling was angled at about 45 degrees in what is sometimes called a stark water. There was a lot of limestone that would have to be quarried, tailored, and placed. When I worked out the volume of stone, the amount surprised me, about 3 million cubic feet taken from nearby Point Claire. Over a beer with my fellow railwaymen, someone said it must be more stone than the Great Pyramid. That comment stuck in my mind, and eventually I was able to learn that the Giza Pyramid was about 460 feet high and 755 feet on a side, with a volume of around 87 million cubic feet. Indeed, you can compute the volume as the base length times the base width times the height all over 3. The claims of my drinking friend were much exaggerated, but seem to have acquired a popular currency, even to this day. Of course, the pyramid did not have to sit in fast-moving water, often very cold and freezing. After the piers were built, the joints between the stone blocks were pointed, then grout forced into the gaps from the inside. We could not afford to have water get in cracks, then freeze. I therefore had another calculation for the volume of grout to be prepared for each pier. The Victoria Bridge was first used by a freight train on December 12, 1859, but was officially opened by the Prince of Wales on August 25, 1860. Geraldine and I were there, of course, almost within arm's reach of the prince, since we were considered part of the official entourage due to my work. That was definitely a special day. 50. Remembering those celebrations, I came out of my reverie as the northbound express slowed for a grade. It was strange that Geraldine did not figure much in those memories in the way that Amelia surely would. Nor had I thought much of the men injured or killed. We lost 26 dead out of over 3,000, which was considered a good safety record for the time. I know not if that included those who died of the cholera in 1854, before I arrived in Matt. At that time, of course, the cholera was everywhere. Dr. John Snow was in that very year, active in getting the handle of the Broad Street pump in Soho, London, removed, thereby showing that contaminated water was the agency of transmission. However, it was not for some years that his theory was confirmed, and his brilliant use of numbers and graphs in support of the public health vindicated. Amelia rolled against me and murmured something that included my name. I did not hear precisely, but her tone was affectionate. Possibly she did not wake. Though lying beside her, I fell to thinking of the early years with Geraldine.